Hi again, Pre-ETS representatives. We have come to the final Pre-ETS training module, which will cover purchasing for work experiences. This training is the sixth in a series of 6 that were recorded in February of 2021. And after completing this final module, we will ask that you complete an evaluation that will be linked at the end. This agenda, or the agenda for this module, is as follows. First, we will review work experience services. Then we will talk about work experience intermediate job search. We will talk about work experience follow-up services, work experience wages, and then review some examples for authorizing. All right, we're going to start with a quick review of what is encompassed within work experience services. As was indicated in the last module, there are 3 titles within the type of Pre-ETS work-based learning services. They are introductory work activities, work experience services, and work experience wages. The next 2 slides remind you of the definition of work experience services. Bottom line, work experience services is authorized when you want a provider to help a student obtain and be successful in a work experience. These, again, are all of the activities that can be included within work experience services. So it includes the first meeting, developing or locating the work experience, orienting the student, and following up with them. This slide also lists out the number of hours that can be authorized for work experience services. So we can authorize up to 30 hours when the provider will be helping the student with an intermediate job search where the employer will pay the wages, up to 20 hours when they will help develop a short-term work experience, and then 10 hours when they will help support a short-term experience where the site is already developed. Know that you are able to authorize beyond the 30, 20, and 10-hour limits, but you must gain your supervisor approval in order to do that. So how long should a short-term work experience last? A good benchmark is 120 hours. However, we don't limit experiences to 120 hours. They can go longer. You also do not need approval from your supervisor to go beyond the 120 hours. The key is for the length of time for the work experience to be a team decision between you, the student, the provider, the employer, and then any others on the team. Furthermore, they shouldn't last indefinitely. If a student wants a long-term experience, then a referral for a provider to help find an intermediate employer-paid experience might be in order. Let's talk more about the intermediate job search. When you prepare to refer a student for help with obtaining an intermediate job, there are activities that you should engage in with the student, as are indicated here. First, you'll want to review the placement team approach, and we will talk more about that in a minute when we talk about the placement plan. You want to help the student choose a provider through an informed choice process. In other words, provide them information about who's available in the area and let them know that they get to choose who they work with. You'll want to identify their interests and goals for the work experience, along with their employment-related skills and abilities. Labor market information is another important thing to review. In other words, what types of jobs are available within their areas of interest. You'll want to discuss whether they have a criminal background, since this could impact certain jobs they may want to apply for. And finally, if the student receives public benefits such as medical assistance or SSI, it will be important to have a conversation with the student and their family about how work will impact those benefits. The Disability Benefits 101 website is a great resource to use with students and families, but you can also refer a student to a provider for workplace readiness training within the area of benefits information services to help review that as well. So we'll make sure you'll get more training about talking about benefits over time in your tenure here as a Pre-ETS representative. Once you've done the pre-job search activities, here's the process for making a referral. Step 1 is to authorize 1 to 2 hours of work experience services to cover time for the first meeting. Step 2 would be to complete all 3 pages of the Pre-ETS referral for potentially eligible students form and submit this form along with the authorization to the provider. Step 3 is for the first meeting to be held. During that meeting, a placement plan is completed, and I'm going to review that on the next slide. Step 4 is to discuss with the provider how much time should be authorized. Again, you can authorize up to 30 hours for the provider to help the student find the job, to orient them to the job, and then to provide follow-up. Here's a little more information about the first meeting for an intermediate job search. During this meeting, the provider must take the lead in ensuring that the placement plan is developed. VRS has a placement plan template that providers can use, although some providers have their own template, and that is fine as long as all of the same information is included. The placement plan reviews the roles and responsibilities of the student, the placement professional, and the Pre-ETS representative. All 3 of these core team members sign the placement plan and all should get a copy. Now I'm going to review the placement plan with you just real briefly here. So the placement plan is 2 pages, and the provider again takes the lead on this, but you'll just want to make sure they remember to do that in that first meeting when it's an intermediate job search. So they would check at the top that it's for placement for a Pre-ETS work experience, and then review some of this information that's already on the referral form. And then it goes through a section for, first of all, the student who's the job seeker. Note that it says check all that apply. It's not saying that everything needs to be checked, only those things that are applicable for this student. So those are reviewed and checked, and then the student signs. And then you get to the section where it talks about the placement professional responsibilities. Again, checking all that apply. And then finally, the section where you as the Pre-ETS representative will review your responsibilities and then also sign. So it's pretty straightforward. Also during the first meeting, these items should also be discussed as applicable. So transportation, housing, if that's an issue for the student, care arrangements, if they had a child, they had a spouse or parents that needed care, medical insurance, public benefits, cultural or religious considerations, disability disclosure, if that's something that they need to be thinking about, support systems that are available to the student, and then verifying the employment authorization documents, such as their I-9 documentation that they need to have. So their ID or their social security card. I shouldn't say and or, it's the ID and social security card. Okay, so we have another desk aid for you, and this one helps walk you through the process of referring and authorizing for a work experience. The first link on the left is a flow chart. The second link on the right has the exact same information, but it's listed in an accessible table version. So I'm just going to pull up the flow chart and walk you through that. So you're about to authorize for a work experience. You start at the top of the flow chart. What type of work experience is it? So if it's an intermediate job, well, you would go down the left-hand column here. So let's say it is an intermediate job where the employer is going to pay the wages. Then you follow the column that says student is potentially eligible. That's who you're serving, of course. And you authorize 1 to 2 hours of pre-ETS work-based learning, work experience services at $75 an hour for the first meeting. Complete all 3 pages of the pre-ETS referral form. And then the intake, or in your case, the first meeting takes place and takes our first students who are eligible. The placement plan is completed at that meeting. And then again, you authorize up to 30 hours as work experience services at $75 an hour. And it reminds you of what's included within that time. That billable time can also include phone calls, emails, etc., with the student and their team. That you can go beyond the 30 hours if you have your RAM approval. And then this is just for students who are eligible for VR. They can receive work-based learning coaching if they need it. Now keep in mind, if you're working with a student and you think they might need work-based learning coaching, it would be best to consult with the counselor ahead of time to see if there should be a referral before the work experience to make sure those needs are met. Now we'll go back to the top again. If it's a short-term work experience, you follow this column on the right. This is when the provider will be paying the wages. Again, follow the column here, student is potentially eligible. Walks you through the same thing that you would authorize 1 to 2 hours for the first meeting, complete the pre-ETS referral form. The intake or first meeting takes place, and then from there, authorizing is dependent on whether the site is already developed or the provider will develop the site. So 10 hours if it's already developed, up to 20 hours if they need to develop it. Reminds you of what's included, that you can go beyond those hours with RAM approval. And then it also reminds you that you need to authorize for work experience wages for these types of experiences. So it's at the prevailing wage plus 50% administrative costs. And the number of hours can be more or less than 120 hours. And you do not need RAM approval for the number of hours for a work experience. So that's how that flow chart can be helpful to you. Throughout the process of the student obtaining a job, these items also should be discussed ongoingly as needed to ensure that anything that the student needs is addressed. So again, disability disclosure, and these sort of independent living services, their benefits, and reasonable accommodations. This slide gives more detail about what activities within the job placement process can and should happen. So it includes identifying and developing the job opportunities, assisting with creating and updating resumes, job applications and pre-employment tests, help with preparing for interviews, cover letters and thank you letters, of course, making sure that the job is a good match, and then also assisting employers to identify and eliminate any barriers. We've had questions and confusion from providers about reporting during the intermediate job search. So here's just a little bit of context for you about why they get confused. So counselors will authorize a PBA, which is short for performance-based agreement. So it's how we authorize when an individual we're serving is going through a typical job search for like the final job. So with the PBA process, providers are required to provide communication updates twice a month. And there's a particular form that they're required to use for that. So note that the twice monthly communication update is not required for pre-ETS work experience or for an intermediate job search. Providers also do not need to use the communication update form. Instead, for an intermediate job search, providers are encouraged to submit monthly reports and invoices, and there isn't a template for these updates. They should just list each date of the service, what occurred, and how much time was spent, just as they would for any other pre-ETS service. Now let's talk a bit about the work experience follow-up process, which is what a partner provides after a student has started the work experience. The definition of follow-up is contact with the student and/or the employer to determine ongoing satisfaction with the work experience and assist with problem solving as needed. Note that some students may get a job without an employer knowing that VRS or the community partner is involved. In those cases, there isn't a requirement for the employer follow-up to happen. It just depends on the student's needs and what is agreed upon by the student and their support team. The time is authorized as work experience services at $75 an hour. And the amount of follow-up provided is also agreed upon by the student, the provider, VRS, and the student's family, the employer, or others that support the student may also have input into that decision. Lastly, the follow-up can be provided on or off the job site using whatever mode of communication is preferred by the student and/or the employer if they're involved. So it could be email, text, phone, or face-to-face. It's also important to remember that pre-ETS work experiences aren't meant to be used as a formal assessment. Instead, they're meant to be a student-driven experience. And if anyone is giving input on how the experience is going, it should come from the student and/or the employer as applicable. So with that in mind, we ask that providers give reports that are objective. There is a pre-ETS work experience follow-up report template that providers can use to report the follow-up services to VRS if they so choose. They aren't required to use this template, but it can be helpful if they need assistance with how they should structure their follow-up reports. All right, once again, we're just gonna review real quickly work experience wages again. This was the definition that we reviewed in the last module. And again, work experience wages are only authorized to cover the student's wage and the administrative costs to the provider for that wage. And once again, the wage should be a prevailing wage that is determined by reviewing similar entry-level positions within the company or a similar business within the region. Then be sure that the 50% administrative cost is put on top of that wage to cover those costs of the employer. So now we'll go through some examples of how authorizing will look for work experience services. We've included an example of an intermediate job search, a short-term work experience where the provider needs to develop a site, and an example of a short-term experience where the site is already developed. Example number 1 is Stephen. He is a senior in high school who has never had a job. He needs assistance to get an intermediate job where the employer pays his wages. He would like to do stocking in a retail store. Here's what Stephen's authorizations will look like. First, 1 to 2 hours of work experience services is authorized at $75 an hour for the first meeting. After the first meeting, up to 30 hours of work experience services can be authorized to help Stephen search for the job, to orient him to the job, and then follow up with him and the employer if needed after he starts the job. Keep in mind that the job search can also include prep, employer development, team meetings, and travel. The next example is Sadie, who is a junior in high school. She has a long-term goal of becoming an auto mechanic, and so she would love to try out this type of work through a short-term work experience at an auto shop over the summer. Here's how authorizing will go for Sadie. So once again, there's the 1 to 2 hours for the first meeting, then up to 20 hours of work experience services for developing the short-term site, orient her to the experience, and then providing follow-up. And once again, don't forget that prep, employer development, team meetings, and travel can also be included in that time. And then once the site is developed, here's how authorizing will go for the wages. So the provider identified an auto shop willing to host Sadie for this experience. The pay or they pay entry-level shop helpers $11 an hour, so that will be Sadie's wage. 50% of $11 is $5.50, so that will be the administrative cost. So the total amount to authorize will then be $16.50 an hour. Her work experience will last 120 hours, so the total authorized is $16.50 times 120, which equals $1,980. Okay, our final example is Hua, who's a 10th grader who dreams of becoming a chef. The community partner already has a relationship with a nearby restaurant, so the site does not need to be developed. It was decided that this experience would last 150 hours. Authorizing for Hua will be as follows: 1 to 2 hours for the first meeting, then up to 10 hours to orient her to the experience and provide follow-up. And the 10 hours can also include prep, team meetings, and travel as needed. Another line on the authorization will be for work experience wages. The entry-level pay for the restaurant is $10.50 an hour, so that will be her wage. And half of that is $5.25 an hour. So the total amount to authorize an hour will be $15.75, which is then multiplied by 150 hours. So the total amount authorized for work experience wages would be $2,362.50. You can find some sample reports and invoices for work experiences on our external website, and they're listed here on that page that we showed you in the last module for the PT contracted providers in the resources section. So Amaya Jackson is an example of intermediate job search, and Scarlett Pine is an example of a short-term work experience. Let's do one final quiz. All right, so once again, pause the recording and answer true or false to the following 7 questions on the next 2 slides. And then once you're done, press play again to hear the answers. All right, let's review the answers. Number 1, you must get RAM approval to authorize beyond the 30, 20, and 10 hours of work experience services time. And the answer to that is true. Number 2, you must also get RAM approval for VRS to fund for a student's wages for a short-term work experience that goes beyond 120 hours. And that is false. You do not need RAM approval for this. It's a decision made by you and the student's team. Number 3, Pre-ETS representatives should complete page 3 of the Pre-ETS referral form when referring students for a work experience, and that is true. Number 4, providers would complete the placement plan with all work experience services referrals. That is actually false. The placement plan is only necessary when the provider will be supporting an intermediate job search. Number 5, we can refer students to a provider to set up an unpaid internship or volunteer position. We covered this in the previous module, but wanted to remind you that this is false. We ask that you coordinate with internal placement staff if you need help setting up an unpaid experience, and that you also should consult with your RAM on any unpaid experiences as well. Number 6, VRS would authorize up to 20 hours of work experience services time for a provider to develop a short-term site, orient the student to the short-term work experience, and then follow up with the student during that experience. And that is true. And finally, VRS would always authorize minimum wage for work experience wages. The answer on that is false. Although it should always be at least minimum wage, it should also be the prevailing wage. If the prevailing wage is minimum wage, then that's fine. If the prevailing wage is more, then we would want to make sure the student is paid whatever that prevailing wage is. All right, so we're finished. Please be sure to click on the link provided on this slide to complete an evaluation. This is really important because it will allow us to record that you completed the 6 training modules, and we also really want your feedback to this training because it will help us with future training as well. And I also want to thank you all for hanging in there with these 6 modules. I know it's less than ideal to receive this training virtually, but hopefully in the very near future, we'll be able to be together. And I look forward to meeting all of you. As always, contact your RAM or myself if you have any other questions.